Okay, here is my first little lesson on Frankensteining patterns. This pattern is, I started out with a New Look for Kids pattern, 6767. It's a pretty basic pattern. You can see there's a bodice and a long skirt. Every major pattern company has this type of pattern in their patterns. You just have to look. Here's another one. This is from Buttrick 6486. And you can see it's really, really similar as far as it's got the little bodice and then the long skirt. The only thing about the Buttrick pattern is that it uses bias tape to finish the seams, and I think that's it's a lot of finishing, especially if you're wanting to do something fast and you don't have a serger and it's all those seams you have to finish. So I'm going to show you a much easier way to put it together. I am going to use the little fluff around the shoulders there from number A or number B. So I did take that piece out of this pattern, and I'm going to use it with this other New Look pattern. Now I don't want it long because I want it to be a little shirt. I don't want it to be a long dress, so we're going to make it a lot shorter, and I'll show you how to do that. So what we did first is I took the pattern pieces, and I'm cutting a size 3, and it's pretty self-explanatory. Just follow what's in the pattern. I cut 2 of the bodice fronts on the fold, one for the outside of the dress and one for the lining. This is just shown on the fold here. And don't let the word lining scare you. Linings are really easy, and they make finishing so much easier and so much faster. I love them. And we're only going to line the very top of the bodice of the dress. So it's not a hard process at all. I picked a coordinating fabric, but you could use anything you have. You could use some white broadcloth or a colored broadcloth, black if you're going to do something dark on the front. And broadcloth is really inexpensive, a couple bucks a yard, and you don't need very much to do this pattern. I think I was just using scraps, so it's not very much at all. Then I went ahead and cut the back pieces. You need two of the outside fabric and then 2 of the lining fabric. Now, this pattern called for a zipper, and I didn't want to add a zipper because I'm not making a full dress or a fancy dress, so I just wanted to put some buttons up the back. So what I did is I added 5/8 of an inch more onto my pattern, and I'll show you how that works here. You can just line that up. I cut a 3, and then when I went ahead and did cut out my pattern, I just added 5/8 of an inch all the way up the back piece. And that'll give me plenty of room for them to overlap, and I can still put a fairly big button. I can put almost a 3/4 inch button on the back, so it gives me a lot of room. I can also choose to do snaps or something like that, so you have a lot of design variables. So I went ahead and added that on the bodice back and on the piece for the lining. So what you do first is you want to take your right sides together, always right sides together, and put your pieces like this. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to sew these shoulder seams in using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. That's how far it is from the edge to where you're stitching at on the machine. Okay, we'll go there. Okay, here we're at the sewing machine, and we're going to go ahead and stitch this shoulder seam in with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. A lot of sewing machines will have marks, and you'll just have to hold a ruler up and figure out, measure from the tip of where your needle goes in to whatever line, and you'll usually have a 5/8 mark somewhere. Make sure you measure from your needle, not just the middle of your foot, because it can be different on different machines. Okay, so here we go. Make sure you guide the fabric through with 2 hands, so that way it's easier to control and it won't shift a lot, and you can get a nice straight stitch. Okay, we'll go back to the table. We'll also do this to the lining. Same thing to the lining. Right sides together and stitch those 2 shoulder seams in, okay? And then we'll go back to the table.
Go.
Okay, now we're back at the table and we're going to trim off the seam allowance. It's not a necessary thing, but when your piece is finished, it'll look a lot better if it doesn't have a great big gap on it. So what we're going to do is we're just going to cut a little bit of the seam allowance off, probably about halfway down the middle of it. Just go ahead and cut those off. Do that for the lining and your outside fabric. Let's cut those off like that. Okay, then we're going to put this together. We're going to open out your outside fabric and then your lining and put right sides together, matching them together there. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we're going to sew these together, and this eliminates the need to have to use any kind of bias binding or anything like that on the edges. Okay, the first thing that we're going to do is we are going to sew the armhole, which is right here. Do not sew these 2 little sides. Don't sew those at all. The only thing that we're going to stitch is just the armhole using a 5/8 seam allowance. Here, around, back to here, and do the same for the other side and the other armhole. Do not sew the sides, just the armhole portion. Okay, I'll go do that and then I'll be right back. Okay, now we're going to sew the armhole in here with using a 5/8 seam allowance, but I wanted to show you something real quick. When you go to sew this in, make sure that you push the seam allowance from the lining one way and the seam allowance for the outside another way. That way the stitches line up together and you'll get a nice flat edge there, and it won't be a big bump on the outside where there's too much fabric. So make sure that you make one go one way and one go the other way. And try to make it the same for the other side of the armhole too, on the other side, so that they're even and everything comes out nice. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and sew this. Pull your strings there. And just guide your fabric around. Careful. And there we go. Okay, now what we're going to do is we've done the armholes, so now we're going to do up the center back, that's the part where it's split, up the center back and around the neck, and then down again on the center back. Now when you sew up, you use your 5/8 seam allowance, you sew up. When you get to here, you're going to have to pivot in the machine, and we'll go and I'll show you how to do that. And then you're going to come around and you're going to pivot again here, and then you're going to go back down. We are not going to sew the bottom. We're not going to sew this bottom part, and we're not going to sew this other bottom part here. Those are going to be left open so we can turn. Okay, so we'll go to the sewing machine and we'll do that part.